Thank you very much, Marco, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. As mentioned, the contribution is focused on survey-based change detection for urban damage assessment. And after an introduction on the scope of the work, we will go through the analyzed data and the processing tool, and we will analyze 4 different case studies, and then we will go through the conclusion. So, just an initial remark, Ithaca, as already mentioned by Silvana, one of my colleagues, is operationally involved in satellite-based emergency mapping, and is part of the service provider consortium, which is serving the European Commission Copernicus Emergency Management Service. And as you can see from the graph on the right side of the slide, emergency mapping based on satellite imagery is nowadays operationally adopted, and the trend is increasing in the last 15 years from 2000 onward. And here we have another graph highlighting an analysis based on 15 years of dataset, which highlights the timeliness of the service, which is one of the main constraints of emergency and rapid mapping service. And more specifically, we can have a look at 2 parameters. The one is the time required to have a first usable satellite imagery from the activation request, which is as an average less than 2 days. And the time required to extract useful information from the dataset, from the satellite dataset, which is in the last year lower than 1 day. So we are talking about something like 12 hours. This graph highlights the fact that the availability of satellite imagery plays a crucial role, and therefore, due to the limitation of optical imagery, the important role that SAR data plays in meeting the timeliness constraints of emergency mapping services, mainly due to the fact that, as we all know, they have an almost all-weather capability, and they can acquire during the day and during the night. Radar imagery is already operationally adopted, especially for flood delineation purposes, exploiting the amplitude information. And we also have other interferometric analysis that can be exploited not in a rapid mapping domain, but in an emergency mapping domain with relaxed time constraints. And we also have some approach based on multi-temporal coherence and amplitude change detection, which is the focus of today's presentation. And the application domain is, as for the session title, the urban domain, and more specifically the urban damage assessment, which is aimed at identifying damages to settlements at different level of aggregation, different level of detail. So we can go from settlement level to building block level to single building level. And the focus is on urban change detection using SAR imagery and using both amplitude information that can have a contradictory behavior, so we can have both a decrease of the backscattering depending on the building type and the building density, as well as an increase of the backscatter signal from the damaged buildings. And we wanted also to test the phase exploit the phase component, and mainly using the coherence parameter. The dataset that we exploited due to the free and open access and the short revisited time are the Sentinel-1 dataset, and the processing tool is the Google Earth engine. We analyzed 4 different case studies, and we want to stress and to highlight that this is a preliminary assessment, and so those that will be presented are still qualitative results. And we decided to address 2 main types of event, earthquakes, so we will go through an Italian and a Mexico case study, and then conflicts, and we will analyze 2 different areas in Turkey and Syria. The qualitative interpretation I mentioned before is based on a very simple and effective, what we call a quick and dirty approach, color composite approach, which is aimed at trying to identify the damaged buildings, exploiting pre and post event SAR imagery, using, for instance, this type of color composite, and having some possible interpretation guidelines. If we go through the first case study, so the unfortunately famous earthquake that was already mentioned in the previous presentation, and if we try to analyze the amplitude change detection map, we have a couple of analyses, one related to the change detection before the event and the change detection before and after the event. So if we compare with optical data and other data set available from different services, we can see that unfortunately it is not possible to detect the most affected area, but it is still possible to identify the presence of new buildings, and in this case this is related to the construction and the setup of internally displaced people camps. And we have two examples from the SAR amplitude change detection map and optical pre and post imagery. If we move to the coherence analysis, and again we have the situation of a coherence analysis before the event, to acquisition before the event, and then the coherence analysis based on an acquisition before and one after the event. In this case, still it is possible to identify the presence of new structures, like the tents to host the people, the evacuated people, as well as in this case it was possible to identify the presence of damaged structure. Of course, in this case we are talking about a very high density of damage and building. Moving to the second earthquake study, which is related to the Mexico earthquake occurred last year, and analyzing the Atlixco area. It is possible to let's say to interpret the amplitude change detection map, taking into account as reference the optical imagery. So in the optical imagery, is it possible to identify few sparse damaged buildings, which were also identified by other emergency mapping service based on satellite imagery, optical satellite imagery. But unfortunately, it is not possible to exploit the amplitude change detection map to this purpose. Also, exploiting the coherence information, still we are not able to detect a single sparse building, mainly due to the resolution of the dataset that we are exploiting. Let's move to a different type of event, from a natural disaster to conflicts. Here we are in a district of a city in Turkey, and we have again the amplitude change detection map before and after a possible event. So we can see some anomaly, and if we exploit the available optical imagery, we can see that actually several building blocks and almost all the buildings in a specific district have been removed, have been destroyed. And this is highlighted by the amplitude change detection map, and it is also possible to highlight differences related to changes in very large structures like stadium. If we move to the coherence analysis, also in this case, it is still possible to identify both changes in the urban pattern. The very last case study and example is related to Damascus in Syria, and we know that there have been changes due to the conflict there, so those are visible in the optical imagery, while they can't be assessed in the amplitude change detection map, as well as in the coherence change detection maps. Again, this is mainly due to the fact that we are talking about sparse building and with respect to the resolution of the adopted dataset. Therefore, concluding, during this preliminary assessment of the fitness for purpose of SAR change detection approaches for detecting damages in a urban environment based on the Sentinel-1 dataset, we can say that it is possibly, and there is the possibility to detect completely destroyed building blocks or very large structure. We find out that it was not possible to detect sparse, destroyed single building or moderately damaged building blocks. Amplitude seems to be more sensitive to the building density and type, as we expected from the theory, while the coherence is more sensitive to surface elevation variation. The key factors that should be taken into account to carry out the sensitivity analysis are the spatial resolution, for sure, but also the building type and material, the damage level and density, and also the urban pattern. So the main process, basically, is the limited weather influence of SAR imagery, as we all know, that allows to carry out a continuous monitoring, which is not possible with optical imagery, especially in at certain latitudes. But the main concern is that the generalization and reliability of similar type of approaches are still an issue from an operational perspective. We have a lot of false positives and negatives that should be assessed through a case-by-case validation, which is always required. And we were wondering, and we would like to test in the future, if integrating this analysis with ancillary dataset, mainly, for instance, the settlement land cover map, in order to try to limit the false positive and negatives mentioned before. And this type of analysis has also been proposed by a group from the NASA during the Mexico earthquake last year, but they also stated the fact that they can be used just as a guidance to identify damaged areas and maybe less reliable over vegetated areas. And this is confirmed also by, we tried to reproduce the analysis that they did, and we also obtained the contradictory results. Let's say that our opinion is that we are still far from an operational use of similar approaches in operational emergency mapping service. Thank you very much for your attention.